Jonathan, this is as we get started on the Notable podcast here, I would have to say that of all the stories that we've covered so far here in Genesis 12 to 25, this is probably the most notable of them, if we could say it that way. Like, of all the stories, I think I've got the most notes in the margin in my heart and in my Bible. And I think it's for good reason. The scholars actually say about Genesis 22, and we're going to take verses 1 to 14. That's all we're going to be able to cover. That this is, quote, the peak of ancient narrative. That's what Robert Alter says, the peak of ancient narrative. In other words, not just the peak of biblical narrative. I mean, this would have won the Nobel Prize of Literature of all of ancient literature. Like, this is it. This is the height of the heights. I mean, Jonathan, come on, like, this is a huge story, not only in terms of its beauty and power, but theologically as well. I'm excited to get into this podcast today. Are you?
Yeah. Anytime you enter into a story that has a one-word title, people call this the Akkada. So one-word title that refers to the Hebrew word that is central in the narrative, means binding. So this is the Akkada. And anytime you run into a story like that, you know that you've come into something incredibly holy. I guess I wouldn't say that I'm excited to cover it as much as I am humbled. That's where I'm at. Like, the scholars are very right. Like, somebody as vaunted as like Eric Auerbach, who wrote a very important comparison of ancient literature and showed that this is the very peak, is right. But as I enter into this story, for me, it's such a deeply spiritual experience that I think I even have trouble bringing language to all of it. And I think that's probably the point.
I think it probably is. There's this is something that we want to do more of evoking today than explaining, and I think it's right to do that. Even the artists have caught into the story over the ages. This used to be, I don't think it's true anymore today, and that might say more about our culture today than anything else. But it used to be that this was one of the favorite biblical stories to interpret for artists. One of them caught my attention by Caravaggio, and an Italian painter, medieval, and he paints really this haunting scene of the Akkada, the binding, and the lighting of the scene really helps tell the whole story. And I can just tell you how my eyes tracked it. The first thing that I saw as I looked at the painting was Isaac, and his eyes are like the eyes of an animal who knows it's about to die, like just filled with terror, extreme terror. He is scared beyond belief, and his father's got a knife that's about to cut the jugular. And it is stunning to look at just the face. That's really what the artists want to capture, this moment. Next, my eyes moved to Abraham. And Abraham, at least in Caravaggio's vision of the scene, he's just sort of stone faced, but you can see the rings around his eyes. Like what I see is resolution in them, and also this deep, deep sadness that he has to do it. And an artist, this is a mountaintop opportunity for them to try to catch everything that Moses really does in the scene, because Moses is very sensational. Like he becomes a biblical cinematographer, if you will. And unlike so much Old Testament narrative, he really zooms in on that moment, like the very moment he lifts the knife, everything is in slow motion and also up close with the biblical camera, if we want to use that metaphor. And everybody wants to try to see that moment. And I think the Holy Spirit wants us to see that moment too. The artists just kind of revel in it, but the theologians struggle with it. They want to make meaning out of it, all the way from Augustine to Luther to Kierkegaard. We'll talk about them. What are we supposed to do with a story like this? That's kind of the big question. What does it mean? What does it mean?
So I wanna build on what you're saying, but before I do that, I want to read just part of it here, and bring us up to the point where you got us, Timothy. And then I want to make a couple comments and build on what you said. So this is Genesis chapter 22. I'm not going to cover all the details right now, maybe point out a couple as I go and then build out some commentary. Sometime later, God tested Abraham. We'll talk about that later in the podcast. He said, "Abraham, here I am," he replied. Here's one note. We get 3 "here I ams" here in this text. Abraham is very willing. We find that out right here. He says, "Here I am" to God, right here. He then says, here am I" to his son Isaac. When Isaac asks, where's the sacrifice? "Here I am." It doesn't actually make it into the English very well, but it's the same thing. And then you have him saying to the angel, "Here I am." So this is Abraham is presented and is a willing, faithful man. And so just pointing that out here, that triplicate there. Then God said to him, "Take your son, your only son, whom you love, Isaac, and go to the region of Moriah, sacrifice him there as a burnt offering on a mountain I will show you." This right away is meant to be evocative. This is meant to be very, very evocative, and a bookend. And Timothy, I know you had some writing on that, and I thought I should interrupt the reading and let you talk about that for a second. All the scholars notice this.
All right, like this is it. I think a bookend is the right way to put it. It evokes Genesis 12, where God says in triplicate form. Let me just page open to it real quick. "Go from your country, your people, and your father's household to the land I will show you." And so right there, Abraham is called to leave behind his past and to move into an unknown future. And here the reverse is taking place. We're going to see how much Abraham has grown in his faith since Genesis chapter 12. And now he is being called to go to Mount Moriah. And we'll talk about that later. That is a significant geographical naming that takes place. And he's told to give up his whole future. And we'll talk. Well, we got to unpack just
leave your
everything.
past and leave your future. Leave your past and leave your future behind. That's what Abraham is called to do. And I just want to maybe make a broader isagogical comment here, that this really is not only the peak of Old Testament literature, it's obviously also the peak of Abraham's faith life. And we'll talk more about that later. And you can easily see that in the text. You can see at the end of Genesis chapter 22, you do get a genealogy. This is wrapping up Abraham's life. And then the rest of the Abraham stories are wrapping up loose ends in Abraham's life. One of them is going to be Sarah, and we'll talk about the death of Sarah. And then the other one is going to be, well, now you got to hand off the patriarchy. You got to hand it all off, the promise to Isaac. And that's Genesis 24, in the marriage of Isaac, so that the line can continue. And so here we have really the peak of Abraham's faith life. And now I'm back into verse 3. Early the next morning, all of this, come on. He doesn't wait at all. It's early the next morning. Abraham got up and loaded his donkey. He took with him 2 of his servants and his son Isaac. When he had cut enough wood for the burnt offering, he set out for the place God had told him about. On the third, this is like, this is maybe a horrific comparison, but this scene, you get this little scene where we watch Abraham cut wood, and come on. Like in Hebrew narrative is notoriously simple and barren of details, which means that every time you do get a detail, it's super significant. Why in the world do we watch Abraham go out and turn into a lumberjack? Why? This is because it's foreshadowing. This is a very violent act. Cutting wood is actually it's a very violent act. It takes a lot of force. And this kind of narrative foreshadowing is very, very powerful. They do this in movies all the time, right?
Well, this whole verse 3 is what you're moving into right now. Early the next morning, like this is, I kind of read that like he's immediately obedient, but it's more than that. Like he's not sleeping well. Like there's no sleeping in for him. And this is so interesting. Like we saw him beg and plead and get on his knees for Sodom and Gomorrah. And then when God says, go and kill your only son, Abraham gets up early in the morning and starts to prepare to do it. Like there's no begging, there's no pleading, there's no interceding, not for Isaac. I mean, there's so many questions here, but what we see is like immediate obedience, but it's also very ominous. Like Abraham becomes an absolute Paul Bunyan, like I've chopped wood before, Jonathan. I know you have too. And you got the splitter and everything, and he's out there and he's just going at it. Like he's going at it. I think that was part of his way of dealing with it and thinking it through. And then he's on his way for 3 days, like which means like the next verse goes like this: on the third day, Abraham looked up and saw the place in the distance. He said to his servant, stay here with the donkey while I and the boy go over there. We will worship and then we'll come back to you. Like I think what this is meant to evoke is that Abraham he's wrestling with this, and the exegetes and the scholars have called this just an exquisite silence. Like it is just a deafening, oppressive, poignant, elegant, sensational silence where nobody says a word, at least that we know of, until 3 days later. So he's thinking this through, like who, and rightly so. Like think about everything that God had asked him to do. He's like, take your son, the one I promised you, by the way, the one that you love, and kill him, knife him. Like this is a violation. This is a violation of fatherly love. This is a violation of God's own conscience that he places in us, not to murder. This is a violation of everything that Abraham had come to believe that God is and was, and he's got to wrestle with that. Like, how does he make sense of this morally? How does it make sense theologically? And so in his heart, I imagine all of these things are going around. And he's like, God, are you a monster? Like, how? Why should I do this? What is it you're trying to show me, God? And how does the doctrine of the resurrection play in here? Like, this is a big moment, and it's all like screaming underneath the details. Like, that's what I see there.
Yeah, and it calls to each of us to enter into this. And like, so he goes out and cuts wood, and you help me imagine that. Like, what's he doing? Like, what's he doing cutting wood? How's he bringing down that axe, and why is he bringing down that axe? And he could have had somebody else do that. He goes out and does it himself. But then he says in verse 5, and I want to point this out because this is going to come up significant as we make some applications of the story. He said to his servants, "Stay here with the donkey while I and the boy go over there. We will worship, and then we will come back to you." So on the front end of this, we learn what Abraham's resolution is. And I heard one pastor talk about this, and I thought it was helpful. Like, what are you going to do when you're in a trial, when you're being tempted and stuff like that? What are you going to do? How about your worship? It's a way of framing the issue for us. We can worship when we're going through something this difficult. But on the back half of this, you'll notice that Abraham actually makes a statement of faith. Sometimes I think we look at the New Testament and we think that these New Testament writers are just the Holy Spirit's given them something that's not in the text at all. But in Hebrews, where the writer talks about that Abraham's imagining that Isaac is coming back from the dead, it's actually right here in the text. He says, "We will worship, and then we will come back to you." So Abraham is sharing his confidence there that Isaac's coming back. Isaac's coming back. Isaac's coming back. It's sitting right there.
Somehow.
Right.
Either that, or you have to read Abraham down there and say he's telling a little bit of a wishy-washy story that he himself doesn't even believe. It's hard.
He's fabricating it.
He's telling what he needs to say. So it's hard to say what he's trying to say. It could be, you could read him up that way and get that. But no matter what way you read it, like, this is a very poignant moment. And then it's almost as if, like, this is such a sensitive, really sensational story, because what happens next is this is what we're told. We get this such a tender conversation on the way up the mountain. It says, Abraham took the wood for the burnt offering and placed it on his son Isaac, and he himself carried the fire and the knife. Actually, I want to just talk about that for a second. Right, even those details, like, even this is why this is such a mountaintop story, the peak of ancient narrative, like we said. Like, even those details, he took the wood for the burnt offering, so he puts it on Isaac, the wood, and then he takes the dangerous stuff for himself. Like, he is protecting Isaac on the up the mountain.
Yeah, he doesn't let him have the fire and the knife.
I don't give my daughters the knife either, right? So he's got the dangerous stuff, and that's going to play out a little bit more as the dialogue happens next. Like, there's no way he's going to let Isaac accidentally fall on the knife. And by the way, this isn't the normal Hebrew word for knife. Some scholars actually believe that this is more like a meat cleaver, like one of those, like a butcher that you just kind of slam down on a table to lop off a leg or a head or something like that, which kind of adds to if that's what this is, and it may be a meat cleaver instead of like a table knife or something like that. That's significant. So he's got this this cutting knife cleaver thing, and this is what happens next. As the two of them went on together, Isaac spoke up and said to his father Abraham, "Father." "Yes, my son," Abraham replied. "The fire and the wood are here," Isaac said, "but where is the lamb for the burnt offering?" Abraham answered, "God himself will provide the lamb for the burnt offering." And the two of them went on together. So there's this Isaac.
Woo.
There's a lot of things I want to notice, but first of all, Isaac is unwilling to mention the cleaver or the knife. He can't talk about it.
Fire, the wood are here, and a knife.
So he almost
So
is
essential.
intuiting like that there's something wrong in the situation. He knows it, and then he says it out loud. He doesn't want to talk about the violence that's possible. And and then the other thing that's noticeable here and is just the emotional quality of the exchange, the relational quality. Like Abraham and Isaac had a beautiful father and son relationship, and you can see that in the way that they dress each other so respectfully and so lovingly. And Abraham can't bring himself to tell Isaac what God's told him to do. Like he for the moment he hides that from his son, and in an expression of faith he says God's gonna provide the sacrificial lamb, and then the silence ensues again. The silence ensues. I don't know if you wanted to add on to that, Jonathan, at all. Like this is it's just a gripping scene. Such a gripping scene.
And that's the structure of the story. You do the narrative provides the framework, but actually the dialogue in the story is where the story really does come home. You get these moments that are just full of pathos and love and tension that a knife can cut in so many different ways. And the two of them went on together. And I can only say at this point, before we read the next verses, that both of these men then together in faith end up, well, we're going to see Isaac moves forward in faith too.
Yeah, and I think it's important to say that, like, it's difficult to like
it's a peak
down,
of Isaac's life too.
Yeah, it's difficult to pin down exactly how old Isaac was here, but he's old enough to have an intelligent conversation like we just witnessed. And a lot of people don't imagine him to be like an 8-year-old. Like most people imagine him to be like late teens and early 20s, which means that Abraham he's a Paul Bunyan. Like the physicality that we have witnessed in these chapters of Abraham is significant. Like here he's chopping wood. We saw him earlier. He was able to chop in half a heifer, which is a significant. I mean, I think that would wear me out, Jonathan. I wouldn't even know where to start to get it. heifer in half. But so Abraham's a bit of a beast. But a lot of people think that Isaac was old enough to at least be able to resist and run away, and he doesn't. The other thing that I think's important to, or at least interesting to discuss, is that Soren Kierkegaard, I think, does best with this. There's so many questions in this story. I read, he wrote a philosophical work called Fear and Trembling that goes on for like 600 pages, just on this one account, just on this account. It's an incredible read. I made a lowly and pitiful start into it, but he actually reimagines the story like this, and I think it's helpful for reflecting on the story, where he imagines the scene a little bit differently, where Abraham actually lets him in on the plan, and Abraham says to him, "I'm going to kill you, son." And then the scene changes quite a bit, where Isaac actually pleads for his life, and Isaac actually begins to pray to God to rescue him from his crazy father. And then these are the words that Kierkegaard puts into Abraham's mouth. Abraham prays as well and says, "Lord in heaven, I thank you. It is after all better that he believes me to be a monster than he should lose faith in you." So he was concerned about the faith life of his son. If Isaac would have found out that God had said that he needed to be killed, like, what does that do to the faith life of Isaac? And there's so many, some of this is speculation. How did this all end up impacting Isaac? It's very interesting to track the rest of his life, how passive he becomes. Doesn't even, like, he's the 40-year-old man, still not married. Abraham has to go out and get him a wife. He becomes really a bit player in his own family, and his twin boys start to run over him, and his wife as well. So you have to wonder, like, how did this event impact Isaac, and was it positive or was it negative for his faith life? And also how it impacted Abraham as well. And we'll unpack that a little bit later, but whew, I've said a lot right there. It's so many questions as we read the story. Should we keep reading?
Yeah, I want to keep reading and get to the peak, and then I have some commentary I want to break into myself. So now I'm in verse 9. When they reached the place God had told him about, Abraham built an altar there and arranged the wood on it. There's the Akkada, he bound his son Isaac and laid him on the altar on top of the wood. So many details. We just see this. Here's Moses, the cinematographer, less narrator, more cinematographer. Then he reached out his hand and took the knife to slay his son. But the angel of the Lord called out to him from heaven, "Abraham, Abraham." "Here I am," he replied. So I want to stop right there and move into that for a second. We'll talk about the emotional tension and all that in just a minute. I want to pause right here and just reflect for a second. I think there's two ways that we can go at this story in a spiritually unhelpful way. One would be that we become distracted from this moment. So I want to talk about that for a second. There's a little midrash. A midrash is a little, basically it's the ancient Jewish commentary on the Bible. And there's a very famous midrash on Genesis chapter 22, an explanation of sorts of Genesis chapter 22, and it's called the midrash of the white ram. And it's actually a made up story, but it's a beautiful little story with huge Christological a huge Christological slant to it. But at any rate, it's a story about the ram that shows up in the story. And in the story goes like this: that God made the ram on the last day of creation, and then he said to the ram, "Wait here." And the ram has to wait in the Garden of Eden, and everything else has to leave the Garden of Eden. So Adam and Eve disobey God. This is how the midrash goes, and all the rest of the animals have to leave, but the ram just waits there, and he waits 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 until God finally told him, "The time is now." And then all of a sudden, this ram who had been kept there since the beginning of creation begins to run. And all of a sudden, the evil one shows up. And the evil one says, "Stop. Don't leave the garden. If you leave the garden, you're going to die." And the ram says, "I must save the child." And he starts running. And he runs, and the evil one tries to stop him, and the evil one tries to stop. And it goes like this. And it really is a beautiful little story that's probably worth reading. But then finally, the evil one tries one last time. The ram had been trying to run faster and faster. And finally, at the top, what happens is the ram finally gets to the sacred mountain. And at the top, he sees the child tied and bound on the altar, and he sees a weeping man. And the ram cries out, "Wait!" And he runs even faster. And he says, "I am here, take me." But the evil one, disguised as a bush of brambles, caught the ram's horns and said, "You shall go no farther." And the ram struggled and cried, "Abraham, I am here, take me." But Abraham didn't hear. And that's the little midrash. And it's a beautiful little story. And I've got no problem with people imagining things. What I want to say about it is where I started, that we don't want to become distracted. And I think this is a distraction. It is very, very difficult for us to keep our eyes on the scene of Abraham with a knife to the throat of his own son. And we tell these beautiful little stories about a ram so that we don't have to look at Abraham. And there's other ways we can be distracted with it too. The other way we can do it, Timothy, is here's another. I think one way we can do it is we can get distracted from the story. We get involved with other things. The other thing that we can do is rationalize it. And this is what you see in the philosophers and the theologians. Instead of actually entering into the story, they do apologetics about it. Oh, God would never. Oh, God meant this. Oh, God meant that. And they have all of these explanations and they rationalize it. I even heard one psychologist rationalize this, saying, "This is a story about sacrifice. God is trying to teach us to sacrifice. This is what we have to do. We have to learn to delay things so we can have rewards later. We need to learn to put things on the altar so that, like our way, we don't eat. We sacrifice some of what we're going to eat in the holiday season or whatever, so that we can have health later," something like that. And they rationalize this, and they actually stop themselves from entering into the difficulty of the story, which is that God is asking Abraham to do something that he can't understand. That God is actually showing up, and he appears as a monster. And Abraham is here trusting God through it. As one theologian said, what Abraham has to do here is he has to believe God against God. The only way that I can get at this story is in my own experience. My wife, I've said this before, I have two brand new little boys in my life, and I hold them every night now. And my wife asked me actually just this morning, she said, I think they're newborns, and she said, are you, not that I wasn't feeling emotionally connected, but she was talking about how she's become more connected to the boys, like every day, like she's spending time with them, getting to know them and things like that. And she asked if I was having the same experience, and I had to think about that for a second, because on the one hand, you know, I love those boys the minute I heard about him, the minute I laid hands on him for the first time. I loved him, and there's a sense in which it was complete and full, but I love him more every day too. And that's sort of the mystery of the capacity of love that the Holy Spirit puts inside of his people. We love more and more and more. And I was forced as a father to boys, you know, I can stand apart from it a little bit, being a father of a daughter, because it's not a perfect parallel. But as a father to a boy, for the first time in my life, I have to stare this in the face and think about, could I do it?
And you have to, you know, the way I just want to notice the way that the story proceeds. Like, really, we spent quite a bit of time unpacking the first 3 days of the story. But the pace of the story is we might call it breathless. Others have. It's very, we get to the moment of the raised hand very quickly, actually, with very little dialogue, and we cover a lot of ground really, really fast. But then we get to this moment where everything slows down. And the only other moment in scripture, at least in the Old Testament, that compares to it in terms of its the way that it pans the scene and slows everything down would be that moment in David and Goliath, where we see David slinging the stone, and then we're told that it literally sinks into the head of Goliath. Like, we get such incredible details, and everything slows down, and that's exactly what we have here. Like, this is like millisecond by millisecond, and the hand is coming up. Caravaggio's painting of this it provoked me. It provoked me because a lot of people picture if it's a cleaver or a knife, you know, pick one. But a lot of people think you plunge it into their heart. That's not the way that you would have done this. Actually, it's not the way that you would have done this. You actually would have bled them out first. That was the normal procedure for a sacrificial act. You have to bleed them out first, and then you gut them, and then you put the meat up. So I think Caravaggio's right that he would have had to slit his own son's throat, and that's really what we have right here in plain Hebrew in front of us. And we're asked to sit with that for a moment. That and then at the last possible moment, if we could actually move on with the story, Jonathan, and just keep reading. I'm going to pick it up with verse 11. But the angel of the Lord called out to him from heaven, Abraham, Abraham. So this double, really emotive repetition of his name. Here I am, he replied. Do not lay a hand on the boy, he said. Do not do anything to him. Now I know that you fear God, because you have not withheld from me your son, your only son. Abraham looked up, and there in the thicket he saw a ram caught by its horns. He went over and took the ram and sacrificed it as a burnt offering instead of his son. So Abraham called that place, the Lord will provide. By the way, that means Jireh. And to this day it is said, on the mountain of the Lord it will be provided. So in the nick of time, God provides a ram. There is a vicarious substitution that takes place, and Abraham's faith in the process wins a great, great, great victory. And that's the story. You want to move into any of those final details, Jonathan?
I don't think so. I think it's the only thing I would say is to our listeners is spend time in the story, reliving it. Don't do it in this way. A couple suggestions. One would be do it with knowledge. So verse 1 is actually a spoiler alert. Sometime later, God tested Abraham. We know what's going on in the story. Remember, Abraham didn't. He didn't know. He did not know that this was a test. He couldn't have. We do. So in other words, what I'm trying to say is, as we experience the story, Moses doesn't want us to experience the story as scary. We actually know that it's going to turn out just fine because God is doing something here. Abraham has no such resolution, but we do. And so when we go into the story, the tension is not, is it going to turn out well? God has his hands on this. We know this. The tension here is, what's Abraham going to do? Is he going to be able to survive this fire? Is he going to come out the other side of this okay? And so we watch Abraham wondering, is he going to make it past? And then he does. So we can experience the story that way. Not how is Abraham going to move through all of this emotional difficulty? I do think, Timothy, you and I have been trying to be evocative more in this podcast than we have been. Probably theological or rationalistic or something like that, and that's on purpose. That's exactly how the narrative reads. We don't get massive theological statements here. We get a lot of evocation and image and discourse and dialogue, and I think that's the right way to go about this. You can look at Caravaggio's painting. You can also Google the sacrifice of Isaac, and you'll find other images that I think are really powerful to contemplate. Like, for example, in Florence, there's a couple reliefs that you can look at side by side of the sacrifice of Isaac by a couple of very famous workers in bronze. And there you can see different ways that artists have depicted this. And it's powerful to think about how this might have gone. It's another way. Like, one of the artists has Abraham being very aggressive. He's like almost like leaning into it, and then the angel of the Lord like grabs him and stops him. And in another one, Abraham is almost pictured beautifully in sort of ancient terms, where there's light and there's proportion, there's integrity to the image, and those are helpful ways to enter into what's going on here.
I think what we have to do next, and maybe what we all end up asking ourselves, like, okay, I read the story. What does it mean in general, but more specifically, what does it mean for me? And I think we have to come at that question, Jonathan, with a lot of humility. But I do think that we can make a really good start into the beginning of an answer. And I think there's three main ways that we can walk away with some wins for ourselves, some wins. And the first two, really actually all three, let's just do that, really flow from the scriptures. So the first one I think that we can talk about is how we have to, like, I think it was David Buttrick who said this, that we need to maybe reset or rebuild who we think God is. And we need to, in a sense, um, paint God with different colors. Like so often we think of God as someone who's cuddly, and we have these images of God. Our favorite one is, of course, Jesus, the shepherd, and he's just so gentle, and that's true about God. But it's not the only thing that's true about God. Sometimes God will put the a knife or cleaver into the hand of a father and say, "Kill your child." And so what that does is it impacts, it's meant to impact and purify our faith. And the scriptures talk about that. The scriptures talk about that. So this is from First Peter, and all this. And by the way, this is the way that the story frames it. The story frames it as a test of faith, as a way of getting the dross out of your faith, as a way of understanding just a little bit better who God is, and to paint him with those darker colors sometimes, that to help us understand that sometimes God can appear to be a monster. Like sometimes God is we like to think that God, or we say God is good all the time, but he doesn't always appear to be good. And so this is a test, not a temptation, but a test. And this is what Peter says about tests. He says, "In all this you greatly rejoice, though now for a little while you may have had to suffer grief in all kinds of trials. These have come so that the proven genuineness of your faith, of greater worth than gold, which perishes even though refined by fire, may result in praise, glory, and honor when Jesus Christ is revealed." So a thing like this, and when your faith rises up and says, like Abram said, this is from Hebrews, and says, even though God appears to be a monster, even though I'm about to turn my own son into ashes, I believe that God will raise him up like a phoenix. When your faith does that, it proves its genuineness to the glory of Jesus Christ. It is tested and proven and purified. It gets rid of the dross. And there's so much more that we could say about this, but this is one of the purposes of tests. And it is a takeaway from the story.
Yeah, and Timothy, I want to just point out to our listeners that you are saying something more than that. Faith, Abraham's faith, is revealed. It's proven. And so there's two levels. Like if you look at the text in Genesis chapter 22, you don't get a lot of interpretation of the story. As far as I can tell, you only get 2 verses of that. And that would be verse 1. We know it's a test. And so that's the first way that we can interpret the story. But then we see the Lord himself interpreting the story, and that's in verse 12. He says, "Do not lay a hand on the boy. Do not do anything to him. Now I know," so here it is. "Now I know that you fear God, because you have not withheld from me your son, your only son." And so I want to talk about, this is anthropomorphic language. God is talking about knowing here. And I want to make a bit of a distinction. God obviously, we say in systematic theology, God has foreknowledge. Like in the Midrash talks about this. Imagines this conversation that Abraham has with the Lord. And Abraham said, "But Lord, why did you have to test me? You know all things. You knew that I would do anything you asked, even give you my only son." And then the Midrash imagines the Lord saying, "I knew, but I wanted the whole world to see your love and your trust in me, so that all people might follow your example." So here, the Midrash is thinking that what's going on here is that God is just revealing what he already knew to the entire world through the story. But that's not what the text says. It actually says in verse 12, now I know that you fear God. It doesn't say now the whole world knows that you fear God. It says now I know. And so, what I want to say is, don't get too caught up in the systematic theology that says God has foreknowledge. Of course, God has foreknowledge, but we're speaking anthropomorphically here. What's going on? So I can speak humanly. Let's talk in the human terms, because we're talking, even the holy writers talking human terms. I can know that my wife wants to marry me when I'm engaged, if I'm engaged or she's my fiance. But on the wedding day, and after she's made her promises to me, I can say, now I know that you want to marry me. So I can trust it beforehand, and I can know it beforehand, but there's actually a different kind of knowing that comes from experience. So God in that moment is knowing, not just by foreknowledge, but by experience, like he's experiencing the faith of Abraham and the fear of Abraham in him. So God is revealed, like faith is revealed. But Timothy, you said something more.
Yeah, and I guess I want to we're going to have a lot of clarifying statements here. It's important as you look at this text, and like what we're really trying to suss out is like, what's the purpose of testing? There's two sides to that coin, isn't there? There's the human side, the Abraham side, the believer side, that it's proven, your faith is proven genuine. It's purified of the dross, like you're able to know better who God is for you. And that happens for Abraham. But that's not the comment that we get, like you said. The other side of the coin is that it does something for God. That's what the text says, and that's actually what God emphasizes here. And what it does is it brings joy. And this is so interesting. It brings joy to God's heart to know experientially, like you said, that your faith will rise up to the test that he gives. And the three words that say, now I know, those are words that show up all over the Old Testament, and they always come out of human mouths. Like, I'm trying to think of examples. This may not have, I'd have to go back and look actually, but they always happen after a believer goes through a test, and then God comes through miraculously. Like, say, God raises someone from the dead through Elijah. See, and then somebody said, now I know. Now I know. And this is what happens throughout the scriptures. This is the only time, actually, in all of Holy Scripture where God watches a believer and his faith rising up to believe in the resurrection of the dead. And then God says, in great joy, now I know. See, now I know that you fear God. And that little piece about fearing God, and like that's the whole kit and caboodle. Like that's what God wanted to shape and form and grow in Abraham's life. And it's to his great joy that now Abraham's faith was proven genuine, that it rose up to the test.
Yeah, so there is that God side. Now I know, and God glories in that, so to speak, this faith that Abraham has in him. But then on the other side is Abraham is proven. And some of the, there's three categories we're trying to develop right now. The first here is we have this purification of faith, but attached to that is the idea of idolatry. Now, some people, I think, possibly, I'm being very guarded in my language here because the story leaves it open, I think. But some people are going to do a huge rant on idolatry here. And, that Abraham was at great risk for over loving his son or something like that. And so, the Lord is asking him to put Isaac on the altar, not just metaphorically, but physically, and spiritually as well, and lay them down to God. And so that's the second category that we can explore. That's, I think, really important, that you do see in verse 2, you get that language, take your son, your only son whom you love. And here, like, just to unpack this for a second, it's okay, take your son, fair enough, it's your child, it's your offspring, and then there's some tension in that. But then the Lord amps it up, says your only son. And of course here, it's not being sassy to point out that Abraham does have another son. His name's Ishmael, but he's not the heir. He's not the guy. He had to be sent away. So when this is not the Lord, not knowing Abraham's own biological history or something like that. Ishmael does exist, but he's talking as far as legally and biologically from him and Sarah. This is the only one. He does hold that significance in his life. And then he's the delight. He's the love of Abraham's heart. And there you do have at least a little direction for us to think about. What are the things that are onlys in our lives, loves in our lives, that can become too important in our lives, that we base all of our hope and all of our future on, like Abraham was told to do with Isaac. Was he at risk of overloving him and over trusting him?
Well, I think there's scriptural reasons to kind of beat ourselves down this path a little bit and talk about idolatry and obedience. We kind of talked about a lot about the faith application, but there is an obedience application here, and James really gives us good reason to talk this way. Listen to what James says. It's James 2, verse 21. Was not our father Abraham considered righteous for what he did when he offered his son Isaac on the altar? So there's Abraham was obedient to God, and when God said sacrifice him, he went and did it. And he was certainly, Isaac was already dead in his heart, only to live again, and God only stopped it from happening physically. And just to put a little flesh and bones on what might this mean for us, there's a part of me, and I don't mean to be harsh, but there's a part of me that thinks that it's not just the only in our lives. We won't even give sometimes just a little bit to God and put it on his altar. Like in Christian churches, there's so much symbolism in we put our offerings in a plate and then they go up and sit on the altar, and sometimes we put a whole lot less than our precious boy, if we can put it in stark relief. Or we can't even give up part of our Sunday to hear his word. Sometimes I have people tell me like, oh, pastor, I think God will understand if I miss church. And, I don't want to be a legalist or anything like that, but because people are wanting to work or whatever. But really, you're making a straight up choice not to risk your economic future for a few hours for the sake of your eternal future and your relationship with God, when you choose not to be involved in his word. And I know it doesn't necessarily need to happen on Sunday, but if it's not going to happen on Sunday, when will it? What I'm trying to suss out is, I really believe this, Jonathan, that we're not even willing to put on God's altar even little things. And I think I say that to my own shame and to our lack of obedience. There's a powerful preaching of the law here for us, if we are to use Abraham as example.
Yeah, and we need to get to Christ, and that's where we're going to end in this story. But I want to move into James just a little bit further. James says about this event in Abraham's life, I'm going to quote it here. This is James chapter 2, verse 22, that his faith was made complete by what he did. So his faith was made complete by what he did. So here Abraham lays his obedience, his son, on the altar, and his faith is able to see just how faithful God is to him, and his faith is made complete. And on the one hand, there's a great conviction that can come in our hearts when we see how little we're willing to lay on the altar. And on the other hand, and we can empower this with Christ in just a second, there's an incredible opportunity for us that when we do trust God, God, I'm going to lay down what I think is my economic future. God, I'm going to lay down what I think is my child's athletic future. God, I'm going to lay down my sexuality in this life. If I start with that, if I lay down all these things that are so important to me, when we do that, our faith can be made complete because we're going to see God rise up and keep his promise to us. There is an incredible opportunity here. What if we do come to church and we lay down an economic opportunity, and then guess what? The Lord provides. And we see that.
Always in the nick of time. That's the whole story.
Or we take, we say, what, I'm not going to put my kid in absolutely every little thing. I'm going to make sure I raise my kid up in the Lord. I'm going to lay that down. And then we watch our kid grow up to be a powerful Christian in the world. Like, woo!
Yeah, and I guess what happens then is what you thought was a sacrifice turns into a blessing for you. Right? Everything gets turned on its head then. There's one last thing I wanted to talk about, Jonathan, here. And this is, I think I need to start into it in this way. We need to talk about hermeneutics for a second, because that is a study of biblical interpretation. And there is a very conservative, I'd say, and I think careful approach to hermeneutics that says that unless the New Testament specifically says it, that the Old Testament does not contain types of Christ. In other words, we have to have a New Testament reference to verify that when we're reading the Old Testament, that it refers to Christ. And so there's a school of thought that would look at a text like this from Genesis chapter 2 and be unwilling to say that this has much of anything to say about who Jesus is. Okay, so I want to admit that, but I want to see if we can get. One theologian says that for good hermeneutics to take place, what you need is to get some sort of theological momentum. I like that word. So I want to see if we can get some theological momentum for seeing Christ in this story.
Hey, can I interrupt you just for a second?
Okay. Yeah, go ahead.
I don't think it's not everybody thinks it's for sure that the New Testament doesn't reference this story or see Christ.
Fill me in on that.
There's a theologian named Ross that thinks that the Apostle Paul is alluding to this in Romans 8, verse 32, which says, he who did not spare his own son.
Spare his own son.
Right.
Yeah.
He who did not spare his own son, but gave him up for us all. How will he not? Like, what's Abraham not going to give God now? Exactly. And so I haven't done enough of the research on this, but I know that Ross is somebody who is going to connect this up to the Abraham story and see Christ in it, and that he thinks Paul is doing that here.
I've got it. I'm just saying, I've got at least one book at my shelf that would say, "Don't you dare see Christ here, because it's not in the New Testament." Like, maybe they won't say it like that dramatically, but that's basically what they say. But I want to see, and just let our listeners be the judge, and see if we can get some hermeneutical momentum here for reading this story, not only as a faith test and as a story about obedience, because the scriptures go into both of those places, but also as a type of Christ. And so I want to just point out some of the really provocative details that maybe give us, maybe we can be like a car that it's got no gas in the car, and you just, let's see if we can give it a little push.
Timothy, nobody pops clutches anymore.
All right, but look at first of all. So let's see if we can get some momentum for this. First of all, verse 2, he's called to go to the region of Moriah. Now, I'm no geographical genius. I'm not a historical geographical scholar, but from all the reading that I've done, Mount Moriah, get this, Mount Moriah is, drum roll please, Jerusalem. This is the same place where Christ died. Like, this is where the Jews believe that the world was created. Like, this is Mount Moriah. That to me is a detail that it just kind of sort of blows my mind. And if it wasn't there, I could be like, yeah, maybe it's not about Christ. But so let's keep going. Okay. Second of all, God says, go to Mount Moriah and make a sacrifice. Like, he could have tested Abraham in so many different ways at so many different places. But what he says to do is go make a blood sacrifice, okay, at Jerusalem, at Mount Zion. Let's keep going. The sacrifice is compared to a lamb. Isaac asks about a lamb. Third thing, this is about a father sacrificing a son. So we got relational details here. Then we have the sacrifice almost happening. It doesn't happen. But what does happen is a vicarious substitution of a ram. And we could keep going, but I'm not alone. Like, there's so much momentum to read the story as a type of Christ that it is by far and away, if you look at ancient Christian interpretation, hermeneutics of the story, far and away, what Christians always see is Christ. They see a father making a costly sacrifice for terrible sin on the mountain. A precious son, an only son. Do I need to keep going on?
You didn't even talk. I don't even think, maybe I missed it, Timothy.
Is there more
didn't talk
momentum
about carrying the wood? You didn't talk about that. Both sons carry the wood. You didn't talk about the painful questions of the sons to the father. You didn't talk about how they both lost all hope at the end, and that there's a type of resurrection in this account, and then there's a real resurrection that mounts up later. I mean,
well, there you go. There's more momentum.
Third day.
Yeah.
all that stuff. Let me put it like that. Like, get past like the hermeneutics and all of the theological jargon, and just be a simple Christian. I dare you, I dare anybody to read this story and not think about Jesus Christ our Lord. I just dare you. If you can do that, oh man.
Well, okay, so we have to take this a little further, because by the way, the pre-incarnate Christ, like the second person of the Trinity, is in the story.
Yeah, he's actually here.
He's here.
Pointing
and
to
what
this ram.
what he's right. And so let's just look at that again. He says, don't lay hand on the boy, don't do anything to him. It says the angel of the Lord. Now I know. So he's completely identified himself with God. And so he's saying, don't do it. And we hear him later in the New Testament saying, I'll do it. If we could put it like that, I'll do it. I'm going to do it. And he does do it. He makes the sacrifice. And the Lord does provide on the mountain. He is Jireh. So beautiful.